we could be there in person as we have in years past, but in absence of that, happy to be part of this virtual forum. So thank you to ACE and others for including us. And because we are here virtually, you can see we're a bit of a large crowd, but we figured we had a little bit more flexibility to add some of our foremost experts on these topics. So as Brennan mentioned, we have a data scientist to kick us off and explain what is artificial intelligence. We then have others that are very familiar with compliance program transformation, and they'll give you a little bit more of their background and introduce themselves as we jump into our program. Last reminder, we do want to hear from you. So please feel free to go ahead and put your questions in the chat. If you're a brave soul, come off mute and ask your questions. We do want to take questions and make this as interactive as possible. So Michelle, if we can go to the next slide, let's kick things off. What we thought we would do is really think about AI in this context, right? So what is AI? Why does it matter? And then how can you use AI to make your compliance programs more effective? So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Dr. Ali, and he's going to give us some background, really set the stage on what is AI and why it matters.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Vanessa. If you don't mind going to the next slide, I'm going to start by talking about AI. What is AI? How is it defined? And what is machine learning? And most importantly, what's the relationship between AI and machine learning? Because I've noticed there are a lot of misunderstandings out there. So let me start with AI. AI was defined as the science and engineering of making intelligent machines. And this is how its founding fathers defined it. Now, what is intelligence? Intelligence is a very broad word. So think of a robot. If you want to make a robot as intelligent as a human being, what kind of characteristics do you want that robot to have? So in the early days, and this is all the way back in the 50s, they were thinking about these things. And they're like, okay, we want a robot to be able to see and recognize other people, other objects. Out of that grew the computer vision branch of artificial intelligence. They said, what about natural language understanding? Robots being able to understand what we are saying and be able to act on them. Out of that grew the NLU, natural language understanding, natural language processing branch of artificial intelligence. Navigation, we want a robot to be able to navigate around the room. Out of that grew the field of navigation, self-autonomous vehicles, and things that you might be familiar with today. But most importantly, they recognize that the biggest, maybe the most fundamental character of intelligence is learning, the ability to learn. So we as human beings, as children, for example, growing up, we learn things and we improve over time from our experiences. So they wanted these machines to be able to learn, and out of that grew the machine learning branch of artificial intelligence. So when I hear people say, for example, machine learning is just a bunch of algorithms, but AI is, about building really, really sophisticated machines. That's not true. Everything that's machine learning is naturally AI as well, but not everything that's AI is machine learning. So keep that in mind. That's a relationship. Having said that, machine learning at the moment is the most prominent branch of artificial intelligence. And that's why when we talk about AI, most probably we're talking about machine learning. So people, including me, have started to use the terminology a little bit interchangeably in some instances. For example, during this presentation, I may refer to machine learning as AI and vice versa. Now, let me talk about the significance of machine learning. And I, as a data scientist, started my journey with machine learning all the way back in 1992. That was the year I took my first graduate course in machine learning. Back then, it was considered a career suicide to study machine learning as a graduate student. But back even then, the few of us that were studying it, we knew deep in our hearts that this will be the future of computing. So why is that? So I'm going to walk you through the traditional way of computing that's on the slide to the left. And the way traditional computing works is that you, as a human being, write an algorithm. Think of a computer program that takes some input and generates some output. In the case of compliance, for example, think of input data as transactions. And imagine you want to write a code that, as part of your transaction monitoring exercise, tries to flag transactions that are of high risk. So you hand code these rules and you generate them if and then rules, and if the transaction was amount such and such, if the transaction was above such and such amount, is originated from such a country, it was on such a weekday, then flag it maybe as high risk. So the job of writing that if and then rules falls on people, and that's not an easy thing to do. So we said, let's turn this on its head. What if we just provide the machine with some data, with some examples of the types of things we're interested in, for example, high-risk transactions, and let the machine itself generate that algorithm. So as you can see, this is a complete shift in computing altogether. It's not just a new way of analyzing data, but it's a complete way of doing computing, and it's a future of computing. And I'm gonna wait for the next section to talk about why this is important in the context of compliance, but this is an overall view of machine learning and why it matters so much.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Ali. Maybe I'll jump to Justin to give a bit of a perspective on why it matters and how you've seen machine learning, others start to think about it in the context of their compliance program. Ali, jump in, and then we'll go to Brent on the Home Depot's journey.
Great, great, thank you. So as a quick further introduction to myself, as was Brent said earlier, my name is Justin Hoff, and a partner at PwC, and I spend most of my time working with clients on how to digitize their compliance function and how to help them on a transitional journey of really leveraging the digital assets to help with the overall efficiency of their programs. But to the specific question, Vanessa, thank you. One of the things that we need to think through as we're doing the machine learning process is one of the key things on the slide is the output. So that's what we refer to as labeled data. So one of the things that is the most valuable asset that we have with our clients when we start down these digital journeys is what information do they already have? What are confirmed true positives? Everyone always talks about false positives, which is important because that's still a label. And that also helps drive the effectiveness of the machine learning algorithms. But having the true positives as outputs helps you jumpstart your program. So when you're thinking about how do you actually put this into being, how do you actually start leveraging machine learning and AI, et cetera, one of the things we always encourage our clients to think through is what do we already have from your data, your information? Is it your internal audit tests? Is it any other compliance-based transaction testing? Is it issues that have risen to a legal level where you've done internal investigations or worst case, regulatory investigations? All of that information over the past couple of years or however far back you have is critically valuable in accelerating the machine learning process. One of the things from not just compliance, but just life, right? About a year ago, I think it was Bloomberg wrote an article kind of on Tesla and on Elon Musk's vision that AI in cars and the ability for cars to drive themselves, autonomous vehicles, will save millions of lives in the future. But it's going to mean potentially some people dying today to get there as the machines and the cars learn that process through. Now to date, I think there's been 3, by the way, so we're not talking a large number, but still any loss of life is still a very important factor into kind of society and how we're doing this. So if you look at how Tesla's doing it, their theory is we're going to accelerate the process to get to the model we need to be, but we're comfortable risking a couple things today. Whereas if you look at what Uber and GM are doing, they're building competitive cars to Tesla in the future, autonomous vehicles, but they're building them in the lab to the nth degree. They're not letting anything out of the lab until they are comfortable whether the models and the vehicles are not going to put anything at risk today. So ultimately, from a societal question, what is the right path to get to where you want to be? Is it better to risk a little now to make sure that you have more solutions in the future? Or do you want to wait until the future to make sure it's perfect before you open it up to the masses? And not to get into an ethical or moral conversation here, but that's kind of how you need to look at your machine learning as well in terms of how much confidence are you going to put into that and how it drives your operations is going to be how much information you have today to really get those machine learning models in a place that you're comfortable relying on them to go through the detection for any risks within your organization.
Perfect. Thanks, Justin. I want to jump back quickly to Ali to give also a perspective. I know that you were involved from a regulator perspective in thinking about machine learning AI. So maybe you can touch on that quickly.
Sure. From a regulatory perspective, in my previous life, I used to build risk models for the regulators, and this is the SECs and PCAOBs of the world. Because when I joined those efforts, and this is not that long ago, maybe about a decade ago, they were doing the risk modeling on Excel sheets. So for the SEC to decide which entities they would target, let's say for examinations or inspections, they would have some very simple formulas and an Excel sheets and a couple of data points, and that's how they would decide who to target. But then we told them that there are better ways of analyzing the data that they already had access to. So for example, the investment advisors, as part of their SEC registration, they were submitting very lengthy forms, and the data captured in those forms wasn't being leveraged to decide which entities are of high risk potentially for examination purposes, again, short of maybe a couple of data points and some very simple calculations. So we took all that data and we ended up building very sophisticated risk models for them. And they ended up leveraging those risk models then to decide which entities to target. They did a similar thing with hedge funds after the Bernie Madoff scandal. Similarly, with PCAOB, we were assisting them to leverage the data that's publicly available through the returns, the filings, the public filings and whatnot, and try to, again, leverage that data to assign risks to various companies to decide which ones to target. So the applications on the regulator side were quite vast. I myself were involved with quite a number of them. And then on the commercial side, we're doing a similar thing for our commercial clients to be able to identify risk before perhaps it gets overblown, turns into a scandal, eventually ends up in front of the regulators. So we're doing that again by analyzing vast amounts of both structured, transactional type of data, as well as unstructured, for example, data, emails, and whatnot. So there are a lot of opportunities in terms of AI in this regulatory compliance space.
Perfect. Thank you, Ali, for covering that, and for Justin. So let's transition a bit, because I know in speaking to a lot of our clients, the journey of leveraging data using AI, it is just that, it's a journey. So I want to go to Brent to see, how is the Home Depot thinking about this? How are they, what's the journey been like leveraging technology and thinking about AI?
Hey everybody, Brent Munster here. Been with Home Depot for about 11 years. I lead our audits in the finance and shared services. So think of legal, HR areas. In addition, I have a team in Mexico where I lead our audits there. But I've been with the Home Depot now, as I mentioned, 11 years. We've had a journey with data, and I would love to get to that point where we have fully integrated AI and decisions made by computers, but it takes time, right? So I think that's where my perspective is important here. So Home Depot was built and started in '79. We grew very quickly. Data was not a normal thing. So when I started, we were still using Microsoft Access to pull samples of transactions and maybe just looking at 30 to 40 transactions, trying to group into large buckets, right? And very quickly in the past 11 years, I say quickly, but 11 years is a long time. We've transitioned to a company that is really starting to embrace data. We went through multiple different tools to help us analyze the data. We've brought consultants in, things like that. And really, we're looking at our data that we have to run our company, so we make the best decisions for products to have for our customers, the best pricing in the market, right? We want to be that everyday low cost provider to our customers. So, we've done some things to help us get there, from purchasing companies, data analytics companies, to help us further analyze the data in the market as well as our own data. In addition, we want to help our suppliers with the right information on keeping us in stock, and then what our consumers are enjoying or not enjoying about their products. So we are really looking to the future on how do we continue to leverage the data we have, the data that's out there in the public to drive our business. For me, in internal audit, I mentioned we were still using Access in 2009. And one of the big things that I helped develop in our group is our continuous fraud monitoring program. So we we started with analyzing transactions for simple things like travel and entertainment expenses. We have over $100 million in expense, and we were selecting maybe 100 expense reports, right? Based on some criteria and simple joins. Now I can say we are reviewing multiple things on a regular basis. So we're looking at our, automatic paid credit cards. We're looking at travel and entertainment expense. We're looking at markdowns at stores, in our call centers. We're looking at payroll fraud, looking for ghost employees, things like that. And this has all been a very long journey. But we're finally at the pivotal point where we are analyzing that stuff very much real time. And then we are looking at the next horizon on how do we get better, right? We know all of our false positives. We know we have a good list of kind of what the real positives are, but to get us to that next level where we're taking away some of those false positives so we can really focus in on the, handful of really key items that we need to continue to deep dive is important. So we are there. In addition, on a compliance front, what we've done is really start to look at some of our major regulations, right? And look at, I'll just pull one out, pricing, for example, right? As you can imagine, the Home Depot is the last open for a disaster and the first to reopen once a disaster comes through. We've got regulations to ensure we're not price gouging our customers, right? Plywood doesn't increase. We are real-time monitoring what those prices are and how they fall into our set regulation to ensure that we're not jumping up the price. And then we can immediately attack it. And having that type of program and in correction very quickly is important, because if a suit is brought up against us, we at least are able to say, hey, we are monitoring, we're actively working. And, accidents do happen, mistakes do happen, but we're going to fix it and we're going to do the right thing to our associates and our customers.
Great. Thank you, Brent. Adrian, I know you were also in-house, so I'm going to come to you for a couple perspectives. Also in how you, when you were in-house in that role, thought about the journey with technology and thinking about potential leveraging AI, as well as from a regulator perspective. So maybe let's start with the in-house perspective.
Yeah, no, sure. Thanks, Vanessa. Yeah, and great to be here too. Thanks to everyone. So I'm a relatively new partner to PwC as of about 5 months ago or so. Vanessa touched on it. Prior to coming to PwC, I served in a number of roles as a general counsel and chief compliance officer at Hershey, Patterson, Weatherford, and I was a prosecutor in the DOJ fraud section some years ago as well. So first off, everything has resonated with me thus far in this conversation. Brent, particularly with talking about this being a journey, from an in-house side of the table, 100% agreed. And look, that's candidly also what DOJ and the SEC would expect. A compliance program, in order to be effective, needs to be sort of a living, breathing entity. So you're reacting to the day-to-day business challenges that your business faces. At the end of the day too, you're always going to try to structure your compliance function on a risk-based way. So by that, you're dealing with sort of the higher risk transactions, as Brent talked about, coming up with being able to pivot on those areas and being able to train accordingly, put in policies, accordingly, that react to your real world environment, and kind of shifting to that regulator perspective. And I know we'll talk to it in a bit with the DOJ guidance. Not a huge change by way of the guidance itself in terms of any sort of radical developments, but there is a focus and a continued focus on, does your compliance program work in practice? So, your day-to-day dealings with your commercial functions and other functions around your organization, DOJ's expectations are you're putting in those controls to help deal with those kinds of areas. And I know we're going to talk more around machine learning and AI and the like. You are in a constant risk assessment for your program, and the way you leverage data is probably the best way to go about it. Not only is it something that you should be doing, it is something that DOJ is going to expect for sure going forward.
Yeah, and let's talk about that. I know last week there was a panel speaking to the updated DOJ guidance, so I know this audience is familiar with that. I know data played a larger role than perhaps the prior version of the guidance. So Adrian, how should our audience be thinking about that, and what can they be doing, to better leverage data and think about incorporating AI?
Yeah, no, certainly. Great question, Vanessa. And you know how us lawyers are, we're fantastic with dealing with data. So, so always, I'll tell you, always was a bit of a struggle for me in the past. And I think Justin touched on it really aptly earlier when he says, understanding what data you have available to you there sort of in real time as a function. So when you're structuring your program, again, in order to be more purposeful about it, you're focusing in on how you go to market, where you do business, what places of the world do you do business, so that you can adjust your budgets and you can adjust your headcount to address those areas sort of in real time. And, as we talked about earlier, it's more of an evolution than anything else. I know we talk about it's not just a snapshot in time of what your program looks like. So with the data that you have available and how you're leveraging your risk assessments, how are you learning over time? How are you dealing with some issues that have popped up over time? How are you responding to them? How are you communicating those things to your business? One area though too, and this has certainly been true over the last couple of months, just dealing with the COVID issues, it's been obviously an awful environment that our companies and our folks are dealing with right now. One thing though that I've been seeing, and I'm sure my fellow colleagues here would agree, is that the compliance functions have been brought to the table, particularly in dealing with some of the incident responses related to COVID. So for example, if you're flexing and pivoting and shifting your business by having to deal with different kinds of business partners that you might not ordinarily deal with, or having to go through, or you would like to put through some enhanced due diligence, we've been seeing, or at least I've certainly been seeing, those conversations where that compliance function is really owning their role as a strategic business partner and having a different level of conversation with the rest of the business in order to, one, let's talk about how we keep the lights on and do business. But secondly, how do we address and mitigate against risks associated with sort of this new normal that we're dealing with?
Perfect. I do want to come back to business partners because I think that's an important one when you're thinking about leveraging technology to monitor those business partners. You mentioned diligence, but Ali, Justin, one of you, I'll come to you. How have you seen clients been thinking about, and I know Justin, you touched on this earlier, with this updated guidance and thinking about the regulator expectations, what changes have you seen? Like what can our audience do now to leverage technology AI?
Yeah, I'll make a couple quick comments and pass to Ali, but you just touched upon it, Vanessa, and it's one of the key things, and just to reiterate what Adrian walked through, the new guidance was really focused on the continual nature of everything about your program. As Adrian was saying, your program needs to be a living, breathing function, but your diligence, your analytics, your monitoring, all of that needs to not be snapshots in time. Historically, when people referred to kind of continuous monitoring in a compliance or legal set, it was usually looking at high-risk transactions or high-risk payments, and not so much continually looking at your third parties. We're seeing an active change in that with our clients, partially because of the regulatory expectations, but also just partially it's been proven to be good business to have your pulse on the potential exposure that your third parties are bringing to you. So in some capacities, that's monitoring the external information, the watch list, the sanctions, the adverse media, those types of lists or sources of information. And then it's marrying that up with the internal information and data that you have inside your organization, such as payments, transactions, contract compliance, et cetera. And again, tying back to what Ali opened with is the additional advancements in analytics and the horsepower now that any organization can use. Pretty straightforward. I'm not saying it's, easy as copy and paste, nothing is, but the ability for companies to rapidly get up to speed on how to leverage the analytics to bring together all those different pieces of information to really provide a single holistic view to your executive stakeholders, your boards, you yourself as chief compliance or GCs, et cetera. It's really powerful, and it's one that we're seeing is a much more accelerated roadmap now. Now, everything Brent said is true, by the way, right? The overall process takes time. I'm not saying this is a week-long journey, but with the advancements of technology, it has been able to be more in terms of managing it within, one fiscal year kind of idea as opposed to a 5 or 6 year journey.
Okay. Ali, any thoughts on that?
Sure, I'm going to look at it from a slightly different lens. So when it comes to evaluating any program, one can think about the effectiveness of that program. How effective is it, for example, in the case of transaction monitoring? How effective is it at catching the high-risk transactions? And then on the other hand, you have the efficiency. How efficient is your program? If you examine every single, for example, transaction to make sure that it's not fraudulent or it's not high risk, then that doesn't become very efficient, right? So you like to have, on the one hand, really high effectiveness, but on the other hand, you want to also have high efficiency because you don't want to spend too much money. So balancing between the two is very important. And I think with the adoption of AI and machine learning, the expectation that the effectiveness of your program should naturally go up because these tools allow you to do the more effective job at catching, for example, high-risk transactions. On the other hand, it also helps you with improving the efficiency of your programs. So again, with the adoption of these tools, I think the expectations of the regulators would naturally be to have programs that are not just more efficient, but also more effective. So for example, instead of just manually examining a very small subset of your transactions to make sure everything is okay, now you can do a much broader sweep of the entire data set to make sure that all the transactions that are going through, for example, a given system are sound and there is nothing anomalous about them.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that subset that you previously had manually examined can help then feed the machine learning to then do that broader sweep, Ali, right? That's kind of that link between the two.
That's absolutely correct. So anything you do by way of manually examining the data, as Justin was saying earlier, you can leverage the labels generated for those. For example, is a part of your manual examinations, you've been historically tagging transactions as being truly high risk, or maybe false positive, things that shouldn't have been flagged but were flagged wrongly, or things that are completely benign. So by leveraging that kind of information, you can eventually train a model to do the job as effective as a human, just by observing how the humans have done it manually in the past.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so before I go to Brent, with respect to business partners and how the Home Depot thinks about that, Jill did post a question in the chat, and it says, I'm always interested in how KPIs continue to evolve based on external factors such as COVID, social justice, et cetera. What are best practice suggestions for the intersection of managing and mining HR and compliance ethics data? So that one I'll just kind of throw out there to see who wants to come off mute and take the first shot. If not, I'll call on you.
So was the question about the ethics of AI?
HR, no, I think it's more the intersection of managing and mining HR compliance ethics data. So specific to that type of data.
Yeah, so I'll take a first pass at that one. Look, whenever you're starting to deal with HR at all, you obviously have privacy elements that you need to make sure you're factoring in correctly and appropriately. So part of this is looking at, how many people have access to that data. And, typically speaking within an organization, you're not going to use your HR related data to prove out data models or throw it over to the analyst team to kind of curate and develop new things because of the sensitivity around it. So this is actually where I've worked with a couple clients on using a subset of the machine learning that we didn't really get into. And that is within machine learning, you have supervised learning and then you have unsupervised learning. And there's obviously crossovers and hybrids, et cetera. But generally speaking, it's pretty intuitive in terms of how the names are articulated. Supervised learning is everything we were referencing earlier in terms of leveraging the labeled data where humans have reviewed and dispositioned things and then feed it back into a continual feedback loop. Unsupervised learning, it's more looking at data anomalies in terms of English descriptions. The concept is you're using some very advanced statistical algorithms and clustering in R, et cetera, to help basically have the data tell the story. So in that capacity, is that going to find everything related to historical trends or specific issues that you might be looking for? No. However, it does allow your compliance or legal teams to provide some, or rather perform some advanced analytics on very sensitive data that you don't want necessarily broadly shared or joined. So that is one way in which we've done that. And then more traditionally, once you have some comfort around what you're seeing in that, having some type of hybrid model where you have very restricted access to then help and generate some supervised learning on top of that as well.
Thank you. And Ali, I think when you mentioned ethics, you brought an important point that has been part of a lot of the discussions as we've been talking about social justice, what data is available and how, you know, big companies are mining that data. So maybe if you can touch on that, Ali.
Sure. You know, earlier in the conversation, I talked about the difference between the traditional way of doing computing, for example, the business rules that people were generating, the if and then rules. That's called a knowledge-based approach, and it's very much depends on what humans put into the algorithm. So it was back then very easy to account for things like bias when I'm leveraging an AI system, for example, for hiring purposes. You know, and I'm writing if and then rules to look at certain characteristics. Those rules were written by me. So I was accountable for making sure that there was no bias embedded in those if and then rules. For example, I wasn't taking race into consideration, or I wasn't, you know, taking sex of a person into consideration necessarily. But then you move to the machine learning era, AI era, and a lot of things are data driven. So it's pretty much like a black box to a lot of people. You feed the data and the model comes out. So you fed historical data, for example, for your hirings, and then out comes that model. So people really don't know how that model was generated, and they don't realize that very often somehow some bias might have been introduced to that model, even though a person didn't intentionally put it there. And that doesn't absolve people from the responsibility to make sure that their AI models are ethical and not biased, for example, when it comes to social indicators, for example. And that's becoming, you know, a big topic. It's a very hot topic at the moment, as you can imagine. So again, as the adoption of AI technologies goes up, I think people should also, you know, worry about those other aspects of the technology, such as the ethical implications, not just vis-a-vis the data. For example, the privacy of the data. Are they collecting data on me? Are they using it in the right way? But ultimately also the decisions that come out of those machines and those AI systems to make sure that they're also abiding by ethical, say, standards.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Great question, Jill. I know it's on, you know, a lot of people's minds. So as promised, let's circle back to the third party topic, business partners. This is a hot topic when you know, you think about the regulators, the DOJ updated compliance program guidance, and, you know, missteps that companies may have driven by third parties. So Brent, I'm going to go to you on how the Home Depot thinks about their business partners. What are they doing leveraging technology to help monitor those business partners?
Okay. Yep. Thanks, Vanessa. So real quick, I just wanted to say before we get to the third parties part on the HR and the compliance and ethics data, I think one of the biggest things that we can, you know, you really need the access to the data. So thankfully, you know, being an audit, we've had kind of unhindered access to all data. So we haven't had to necessarily have those fights on why we need the access, why we need the data to pull it. And then two, I think you also need to have, you know, a trusted and secure area to store that information. So I just don't want those to be forgotten, because those are two heavy points, right? And it takes a lot of time and conversation to get that information, then to protect it so only certain folks have the access to it. But we've done a number of things at Home Depot. You know, we've got a very large field-based associate group, right? So whether or not it's looking at union risk in our stores, right? So the compliance and ethics data, seeing what calls and where the calls are coming in from the whistleblower hotlines may indicate there's, you know, a risk in a certain store that maybe we have bad leadership, right? So we look at that on a regular basis. And then absolutely on the HR side, looking at things such as you know, clock in, lunch break, meal break hours, things like that. Minors working in our stores, things like that. There's definitely those opportunities and different ways. It's really just attacking what the problem that you want to do is there. But it is very important that data stays secure. As Justin has mentioned, it's very sensitive, right? And if that stuff leaks out, somebody's getting in the wrong hands, your access is going to be cut off very quickly. So back to the third party side. So, you know, as any company, right, we use third parties to help us manage our day-to-day business. In Mexico is really where I think a lot about our third parties. And, you know, we have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act kind of risk there, right? We do not want to be bribing government officials to get ourselves ahead of the game in various areas. So one of the things we do there for third parties is really start to identify who are all those third parties we use. So we're having regular conversations with the business, right? And saying, hey, what is our risk for each of these third parties? And then kind of grouping them into, hey, this is a third party that really just does some work for us, but they have no interaction with the government. These are some third parties that are a little higher risk because they're actually going out and getting permitting on our behalf. And permitting in Mexico, if you don't know, is very difficult, and it varies tremendously by municipality as well as the state in Mexico. So, you know, it could take us sometimes, I don't even remember how long the oldest store was, but I think we had a store that took us over 5 years to build because it was just permitting. And Home Depot is committed to doing it the right way and not bribing officials. So we want to make sure those third parties that are acting on our behalf to get those permits understand what Home Depot is going to require. So we go through a very stringent process of looking into that third party, having conversations with that third party. So we do background checks and screenings. We look for any red flags or any previously known issues or corruption or bribery that's on their record. We will, once those red flags pass, we will work through to get them onboarded as a vendor, right? So we will have a conversation with them, talk about the Home Depot's values, and make sure they understand that we are going to do everything on the up and up, and we expect them to. In addition, we have them go through a formal training program, and then we also have, you know, specific language built into the contracts with these vendors. And then, you know, one of the great things is we have PwC come help us do some of those audits. So we have an independent look to make sure our vendors are acting the right way and we're doing business the right way as we should be. And of course, you know, there's opportunities that continue to be presented to us on a regular basis, and we work to tighten those gaps and have those conversations and talk to them. One of the great things that we've implemented, we started to do last year, was PwC has a tool called Risk Command that analyzes the data in Mexico on a transaction level basis, looking at specific transactions to some of what we call our CSSPs. Those are our vendors that have interaction with you know, government officials, compliance sensitive service providers. So we'll look at their transactions in specific and sample those and audit those. We'll have the conversations with those third parties that we believe are high risk, so they know that we're constantly looking at them and they're kind of on alert.
Perfect, thank you. And a lot of questions have come in with respect to analytics, you know, the best analytics to identify areas to improve your compliance program. I know that was part of the updated guidance as well. And the second, I think, you know, similar question is, what analytics does the panel suggest to demonstrate new lessons learned provision of the DOJ guidance. So I'll open that up to whoever wants to chime in from, an analytics perspective.
Yeah, I'll take a quick first pass, Vanessa, then obviously welcome anyone else jumping in. But the key thing that you want to think about when you're saying, the air quote best analytics is it's going to really vary depending upon your organization. And I know that answer is probably not going to be one that people want to hear, but it's part of what you need to understand. Where are you going to get the most ROI on the analytics for your individual program? And that's going to vary depending upon the maturity you're currently at. That's going to depend upon the industry or sector you're in. That's going to depend upon the geography you want to focus on. And it really gets back to something that Ali was alluding to earlier, and that is, how do you measure whether or not your program is operating effectively? So kind of turning it back, where do you think you need to demonstrate the effectiveness of your program? And that's where you should start to look at from an analytics perspective. Look, the guidance really clearly articulates that it shouldn't be looking at a snapshot in time. So whatever you do, you want something to be some type of continually performing analytics. And when I say continual, I don't mean necessarily real time. You don't need to dive into real time monitoring immediately. There's ways in which you can step into that and shrink the periodicity as you get more comfortable with it. Because one of the key components of this is, it's not just that you have the black box tool working and generating alerts, et cetera. Today, you still need and probably want humans, your team, your compliance professionals, your legal mindsets to look at those results to determine how much potential risk does that provide to your organization. You want your lawyers to be lawyers. And therefore, you need to make sure you have the right head count, that you have the right escalation channels, you have the right workflow, et cetera. So when I start thinking about what analytics would I start with, it's really making sure, first and foremost, that you have some type of technology foundation that helps you manage that workflow, that case management, that your teams can work seamlessly together. And especially now that they can work virtually together, that someone can post documents or upload documents, et cetera. So when I start thinking through how do companies start, I really recommend kind of what I would call those peripheral technologies to the analytics. And the analytics need to be at the heart of it, but you need to make sure your team has a way of effectively working and dispositioning the things that analytics develop. In terms of specifically what analysis I would start with, again, my opinion is it's always most effective if it's something that your team knows is proven. So again, taking some historical rules-based approach, right? Brent mentioned FCPA earlier. Monitoring for payments or activity to third party with of government affiliations or state-owned entities. Looking for anomalous transactions such as high dollar amounts on weekends, or some basic rules, not rocket science, but start using those to see what kind of volume is in your organization, and then starting to layer on some of those different AI methods that Ali talked to earlier. And again, the concept is the whole process needs to grow and develop. Please don't assume that you're going to jump in right on the deep end. You want to ease your way into that. In terms of how you perform those analytics, it really varies based upon that foundational technology stack that I outlined. I mean, these days, pretty much everyone's using Python almost exclusively to really embody those analytics. So I'd highly recommend having someone on your team with some Python capabilities. But still, at the end of the day, you're looking at data and databases and relational databases. So again, SQL, basic querying on your data environment or your data warehouse, whatever platform you're using, is going to be critical. So you need some type of those base skills, but it's really making sure that you are packaging into your environment the rules that you, the compliance and legal professionals, are comfortable with and know about and have seen that's proven. And now it's just really making them go faster and cover more data with that. And I think I saw one of the questions earlier, Vanessa, I'm gonna add one more comment to this, sorry, is, look, I keep saying data, data, data. A lot of this presumes that you have access to data, and that the data you have access to is good data that you can actually leverage some type of analytical engine on. And I appreciate that is oftentimes a very large assumption. And I will say that a lot of these engagements, when we work with clients, we actually end up spending more time prepping the data and that data environment than actually doing the analytics themselves. As the general global business environment has continued to be more, electronic, more data driven, you're not running into the same, like my first year, right? When we asked for a vendor master list from a client, we literally got a FedEx package with the old dot matrix printers, the little holes on the side, the ribbons that fed through. So that was
You're
their
dating us,
vendor master
Justin. You're
file.
dating us.
I haven't seen that in
I don't
about 20
remember that
years.
at all. I have no idea
So,
what you're talking about.
yeah, hopefully none of you are seeing that when you ask for data. But look, that is reality. And not everyone's going to have a nice, clean relational database.
Yeah.
So you do need to think through that. I would say personally, if you start to run into data integrity issues, try not to let that sink your whole program. Think through where you can focus for pilots or proof of concepts that will show that ROI, that effectiveness that I was talking about earlier, and start there. You don't ever need to start with everything. Please don't ever try to start with everything. You're going to end up in kind of paralysis from analysis. Really pick the right area that you think will generate or demonstrate the best ROI for your organization and start there and then expand out.
Can I piggyback on that,
Perfect.
Justin, too, real quick, too?
Please.
Vanessa, 100% agree with everything Justin said. And on that last point particularly, ROI is where, I can speak from my own experience, is where I struggled, or we struggled as a compliance function, and really understand, hey, did we get the right tool, for example, to monitor those risk-based transactions, but also, was it effective for the organization? So one of the things that I did, particularly when we were at Hershey, is try to bring a commercial lens to that approach as well. So for us at the time, distributors were our key risk area. So ran a parallel process where we ran through our diligence and monitoring with the sales functions in the respective countries. Long story short, we got to a point where the business was better able to forecast their performance and whether they needed to onboard new distributors through our tool. So one last point on that, again, is where I think lawyers aren't usually all that comfortable, is partnering with other folks that are comfortable dealing with data, that have a lot of access to data around the organization. Certainly on your finance teams at IA, like Brent has mentioned before, but also, your IS functions, also your FP&A functions, and commercial data too, depending upon your industry, and where you could start becoming more of that commercial, that business partner. I think you can start demonstrating, a better ROI, because you're getting a more precise view on how you actually go to market and how you conduct your business, while lending that credibility of that compliance approach too, by putting that lens on different kind of conversations you're having with your business partners, as opposed to just being that risk shop that sits over there that checks everything that we do day in and day out.
Right. Absolutely. And we're wrapping up. And there was one question that came in with respect to records management. And Adrian, I think I'd like your perspective on this one, and we can wrap up. So how do you typically store data after you've used it? And does legal get nervous with those analysis hanging around?
Legal's always nervous. But I probably take a different approach. I'd like to hear my fellow colleagues' point of view on this. It's expected, and this is with my regulator hat on, or my old regulator hat on. If you're having a true assessment of your program over time, I don't worry as much about having certain kinds of data around. Now, having said that, you want to be careful in making sure you have privilege around the things you need to have privilege around, but you also want to be able to demonstrate that your program is working. So God forbid you're in front of a regulator at some point, your answer about, sorry, we don't have that stuff anymore, is not going to fly. You need to show some demonstrated process over time, working with your key stakeholders, about your program, and being able to show the data as need be, obviously under, depending on the circumstances, of course. So I would love to hear others' points of view on that. I'm probably a bit more on the riskier side of the spectrum than I think most compliance officers are, just because at the end of the day, I know as a former prosecutor, DOJ, SEC folks still have to actually prove an offense, and recognizing those rules of evidence kind of factors into some of my considerations. So would love to hear other perspectives. I know not everyone is necessarily as risky as I might be.
Well, maybe I'll go to Brent to wrap up. So this is the last comment, and the last question that came in was also about thinking about your third party, vendor audits, investigations during COVID. So maybe if you had anything to add on Adrian's point, and then we can wrap up with the COVID.
Yeah,
question.
agreed that all attorneys are very nervous about keeping any information, right? Where we've really tackled it at the Home Depot is we have conversations with our legal team on a regular basis, right? So what are their top of mind concerns, right? And where do we go from there? And when we need to go into some area where, it's a little more higher risk, we'll make sure we're working under their direction and it's privileged, right? And that's not always the best, but, we'd rather know and have a plan of attack and be able to fix it, or at least have those conversations with executive teams to know that the company is going to accept risk. Because really, it's all about risk reward on a lot of this. And I think that's something when you talk about compliance, you really have to focus on. So I think it's just partnership. Absolutely. Then on, sorry, it was around investigations with third parties on COVID. I think,
yeah, during COVID.
yeah, so, you know, we're still figuring it out, right? COVID's thrown a lot of curveballs to us, right? And we're looking at different things, but where we've really focused is, you know, we can still do it. You do it in a different means, a virtual means, right? So, you know, we just recently, Vanessa was involved in it. We recently just interviewed a bunch of our high risk CS compliance sensitive service providers for our FCPA audit. We did it via Zoom, right? Or Teams or whichever one it was. I can't keep up with all the platforms these days. And, you know, having that has been just a tremendous help because you can really see kind of what you can hear and see what their reactions are to things. And then you know where to dive a little bit further. And then don't forget, you know, you've got a lot of information just internally. So, you know, as you're performing your investigation, don't forget that the resources dealing with those folks every day have additional information and can help you look different ways and help you vet out whether or not what they're telling you is appropriate or what they're giving you is appropriate. So leverage the resources.
Perfect. All right, well, we are at time with that. So thank you. Thanks to the panel. Thanks to all of you for all of your questions. We really appreciate it. I think we're going to wrap up with a sponsor video and have a great rest of the day.